Hello. Good morning. My name is Lucy Fisher, and I'm the Times Defence Correspondent. I'm delighted to be chairing this first panel at the annual RUSI Land Warfare Conference, following a fascinating address from CGS. The theme of the two-day conference is, as you know, securing competitive advantage. And kicking off this morning, our panel will provide what I'm sure will be a thoughtful and provocative scene setter, examining just quite what the landscape of modern competition looks like. They'll be looking at where this competition is taking place, what is being competed over, and by whom. Of course, one of the key tensions facing competing powers is the need to maintain, develop, and fund both significant conventional forces, but also those newer levers required to conduct hybrid warfare. I hope that's a challenge. It's something that we'll look at the next hour. We have some excellent speakers, not all of whom have arrived yet. And before I introduce them, I'd just like to remind everyone that this session will follow the usual RUSI format. We'll have 10-minute presentations that will be on record, followed by a Q&A that will be off record. Ewan Lawson, many of you will know, is Senior Research Fellow in Military Sciences at RUSI. He will be presenting findings from an excellent RUSI publication out this week, exploring the future operating environment, looking at adversaries' strategies to counter the Western mode of war. Lieutenant General Terry Wolff is Director of the Near East South Asia Programme at the National Defense University in Washington. He's also Deputy Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL. It is a role that is both military and political, and one that has granted him crucial insight into conducting military operations in competition with Russian forces in Syria. And Dr. Ronen Bergman, who unfortunately is stuck in traffic but will be joining us, I'm told, is an Israeli journalist who has done unparalleled research in exploring Israel's covert operations against Iran, and in particular its use of assassination. He'll be sharing lessons from his research about the thresholds that separate successful from unsuccessful operations in the grey zone and the moral and strategic costs of various activities. So, Ewan, I'll ask you to kick off, please.
Lucy, thank you, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. It is no coincidence that yesterday we in the military sciences team at RUSI launched our future operating environment paper, which looked out to 2030. Now, you might think that's a fairly limited ambition time-wise, but when I first arrived at RUSI some 4 years ago, I was doing a project on behalf of the Army, looking at the various types of terrain in the period out to 2050. And we were looking at the physical terrain, the human terrain, and the information terrain. And the pace of change in those three different terrains is clearly very different. You know, the physical terrain, it's, broadly speaking, glacial. The human terrain, it's generational, whereas the pace of informational changes is almost daily. So we thought a shorter timescale was more appropriate. At the heart of this paper is an argument about the challenge to what might be called a contemporary Western way of warfare. Now, this is a really complex set of ideas, but at its heart, I think, is the issue of precision. So the imagery from, particularly from the liberation of Kuwait, where actually the number of precision weapons was relatively small, but this imagery of bombs flying in through windows, you know, the mythical story of cruise missiles turning right at traffic lights, you know, this idea of precision, but linking that, I think, to a prioritization of international humanitarian law, an appropriate prioritization of international humanitarian law, and particularly civilian harm, balanced over what we might traditionally have thought of as military necessity. And that this framing is the background to the sort of challenges we're facing now. There are two main elements to the paper. The first of these considers the approaches of potential adversaries, and I'll focus most on that today, and thinks really around ideas about thresholds, about proxies, about economic warfare, and the continuing relevance of terrorism. The second main part of the paper looks at trends, but not so much the traditional focus on tech trends, but more about the need to refocus perhaps on the homeland, the importance of space, and indeed cyberspace. However, it's some 80 pages long, although a ripping read, so I'll just focus on a couple of areas this morning. I would argue that the aim of our potential adversaries today is to avoid direct confrontation with Western conventional military capability. And it does this through staying below the threshold at which we are happy to employ that capability. It's an important reminder, I think, that the enemy has a vote in the utility of our military capability. But how it does this is through the use of a broader selection of the tools of national power, not just the military, but I think particularly interestingly at the moment, the economic and informational levers. And as part of that informational lever, particularly through obfuscation as to what is actually happening, and also the use of proxies to add to that obfuscation. We see Hezbollah, we see China's maritime militias, and we see Ukrainian separatists. At its heart, this challenge is clearly political. It recognizes in our democratic system the employment of military force requires governments to bring together coalitions within domestic politics. And it can be argued, I think, that this has become more difficult after campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan in some states in particular. Linked to this, there is a tendency, I think, to see peace and war as two opposing conditions. And this impacts on the willingness to cross the threshold to big W war, if you like. It can be argued, I think, that this dichotomy is the exception rather than the rule in human history. And it's this struggle to understand what we're in now is reflected in the absolute plethora, the raft of new terms that are thrown about to explain what we're seeing, whether it's the grey zone, whether it's hybrid warfare, whether it's tolerance warfare, or whether it's blended aggression. And I think in part this reflects our need to explain why the West has apparently been caught out, particularly in Crimea, but also elsewhere. If we couldn't or didn't react, it must be something new that's happening which we have not previously seen. As I've mentioned, one tool to keep the contest below the threshold has been the use of disinformation and misinformation. And clearly this has been enabled by the digital revolution and the advent of new forms of media which allow the transmission of stories globally and with a pace not seen before. This can make it very difficult for states to react, particularly when there's a concern to ensure that the response is based on purely accurate information. It allows our adversaries to get inside our OODA loop, particularly in this area. Now, much of this disinformation and misinformation is targeted at public opinion for the political reasons highlighted previously. But as we've seen with efforts against NATO's enhanced forward presence, and also in Ukraine and Georgia, it can also be aimed at impacting on the moral cohesion of the fighting force. So far so interesting, but I guess so what? What does this mean for armed forces and for land forces in particular? And I would just make three brief key points. The first point, I think, is that we absolutely need to refocus at the strategic level. We need to consider new approaches to national defence and security. We need to improve societal engagement and resilience. We need societies and publics who haven't subcontracted defence and security out. I pay my taxes, why is it my problem? But recognise that everyone has a role to play. This isn't about militarising society, but rather the sort of total defence approaches, I use the small t, small d defence approaches, seen in places as various as Denmark, Sweden, Singapore, and Georgia. We've got to help increase society's awareness of the challenges and move beyond trying to just sort out the cross-government challenge as we see through the fusion doctrine. The doctrine that has been brought in after the apparent failure of the comprehensive approach, the integrated approach, and the full spectrum approach. And we've now gone to a doctrine because that will clearly work much better than an approach. The second point I would make is about the pivotal nature of deterrence, and especially conventional deterrence. I would argue conventional deterrence remains key. And clearly a key part of conventional deterrence is having credible land forces. And as CGS mentioned, this is not just about thinking about the fighting equipment, but we must absolutely think about deployability, and we must also think about logistics support. There's no point having fast-moving brigades that can break apart and reform and do all sorts of clever, whizzy things if you haven't got the logistics support in place to keep them fueled, armed, and fed. These forces also need to be exercised regularly. That's to demonstrate capability as well as for our own personal benefits, for our training benefits. We need to build on that sort of work we're seeing in enhanced forward presence, the multinational exercises, and also in Baltic Protector. And I would also suggest that this needs to be linked to more robust and coherent alliance narratives. This is not something we can do on our own. Lastly, and moving down to more of the sort of tactical level of the conversation, we need to resource electronic warfare and theatre level cyber capabilities much better than we have been doing up to now, notwithstanding Secretary of State's recent announcements. I think the work of General Tom Coppinger-Symes and his team is a great example, actually, of how you can move from what at the phrase was almost at the time was almost a meaningless byline of information maneuver, how that's been developed into a really valuable and thoughtful, workable concept, to some really interesting experimentation work. How do you turn this into something which is meaningful and deliverable? And doing all that whilst avoiding the very military distractions of structures, ranks, and cap badges. We need to keep building on this and build on those examples. Thank you.
Lieutenant General Wolfe.
So great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you, RUSI, and to the CDS, thank you for the kind invitation. I'm certainly a practitioner here, not a writer of books, not a writer of pamphlets, not a writer of studies that take you out to 2020, and I have read the pamphlet, it's wonderful. My thoughts for you really are this. I've spent about 39 months working in the coalition business in the efforts to defeat Daesh. And I bring you a perspective about that and the complications associated with that proxy fight. So that's how I will tailor some of my comments today. I grew up in the practical world of being an armored cavalryman in a military culture in which we traditionally saw ourselves as either at peace or war, with war being an undesirable option. And in reaction to those exceptions, we were predisposed to believe that we'd rapidly respond, seek a conclusive end, and return to normalcy. This World War II battleship image, is stuck in my mind. We avoided the Vietnam lessons learned in those fights, which were not definitive and did not seem to have a clear ending. A conflict in which we did not and could not win decisively and could not leave early. An elusive finality. Often it seemed to me that we had an aspirational idea of conflict as a function of how we would like it to unfold and be, versus the reality that confronted us. So I'm going to talk about some of those experiences in this campaign against Daesh. I spent 39 months as the Deputy Special Presidential Envoy, and so I have some perspectives about this as it applies to proxy warfare. As I was thinking about this presentation, it came across an article by one of our scholars at the National Defense University, Frank Hoffman, and he wrote an article recently about the gray zone and hybrid challenges, and he suggested something that caught my attention. And his comment was that the U.S. national security establishment must devote greater attention to the range of challenges and adversaries it faces. The first step is recognizing the diversity of potential conflicts and understanding the relative risks of each. And as such, Frank offered a perspective, and the perspective is a continuation of conflict. And he offers that on the line from left to right, that the first is and are measures short of armed conflict, proxy wars in other words. And then secondly, across the spectrum is irregular warfare and terrorism, then hybrid warfare, and then conventional warfare. And so the great question is, how do you prepare for big wars and great power competition, as well as adversaries who use unconventional methods and non-military means as part of their fight against you? How do you invest wisely? And how do you not overinvest in any of the efforts to fight those, knowing your adversaries will exploit those opportunities? So how do you retain a balanced set of approaches? That seems pretty important to me. I also thought a lot about what our Russian colleagues did in Syria, and that continues today if you're following what's happening in Idlib. And so I went back to look at some recent remarks by the Russian Chief of Defense. And one particular presentation caught my mind from March of 2018, in which he talked about the contemporary nature of armed struggle. And in that in particular, I noted a couple of ideas. Grasmanov said, listen, today individual military specialists are treating the military conflict in Syria as a prototype. And interestingly enough, I found that he noted in his talk to his organization that Syria has provided experience to all troop commanders of military districts, combined arms armies, combined arms air forces and air defense armies, and all the division commanders and nearly half of the combined arms brigade and regimental commanders together with their staffs. They're going to school in Syria. So it seems to me that we can expect to continue to see our Russian friends and enemies, or adversaries if you want, employ an active measure of political, economic, and subversive activities, including distortion, disinformation, subversion, propaganda, and cyber activities, as well as other forms of non-military aggression, exactly as the CDS talked about moments ago. You know, inside the U.S. Department of Defense enterprise, we're struggling to understand and how to put into place a national defense strategy. We're looking at the changed environment. We're looking at a new strategic approach. We're looking at some of the same old mission sets. We're looking at how to deal with this great power competition as well as regional challenges without excluding the terrorist problem set. And I think that's important to understand. But buried in there is a highlight of a strategic approach which requires an integration of the instruments of national power: diplomacy, intelligence, the military arm, economics, finance, law enforcement, all in order to expand the competitive space to compete, deter, and certainly win in an increasingly complex environment. So in my mind, how do you get the balance right? In Iraq, over 3 tours, I watched our conventional forces gain a soft-like set of techniques and procedures to operate in a manner like the high-end counterterrorism forces. But that took 8 years. That took 8 years. Conventional forces had to learn to adapt, whether the task was counterterrorism or presence activities or building partner capacity, such as advise and assist or advise and assist in a company, or working with our interagency colleagues, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our aid and assistance people, and our interagency colleagues. I think all those skills are going to be necessary in this current set of proxy fights and in the future. They certainly were in the last decade in Iraq, and they were needed in the past 4 or 5 years in the fight against Daesh that has run from 2014 on. So having offered a kind of a brief perspective, I'll make 3 major points as I think about my experiences in Iraq and northeastern Syria. Point number 1, you got to get the context right. The fight against core Daesh was different in Iraq versus northeastern Syria. In Iraq, we were dealing with the government of Iraq and our Iraqi security force partners, while in northeastern Syria, we dealt with the Syrian Democratic Forces. They are not 2 sides of the same coin. The global coalition's task was to help our partners fight and defeat Daesh and Daesh's conventional fighting capability, defeat the phony caliphate, and liberate a lot of people. We realized this effort swirled around the Syrian civil war. And when the Russians came in 2015 and doubled down, it changed the diplomatic and political landscape. In essence, Russia became Assad's strategic guarantor. That changed the context on the ground. Diplomatic discussions with Russia as part of the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254, all in an effort to end the Syrian civil war, led to discussions and opportunities. And ultimately, part of those diplomatic discussions established a boundary between the coalition and the Russian and Assad's forces. You good military members know what that is. It was the Euphrates River. Pretty simple. But likewise, there were efforts by the Russians and the regime to ignore the boundary at times and project, if you will, both military and non-military power across that boundary. And my colleague talked about some of those already in terms of electromagnetic activities, ISR, and things of that sort. What we found was that to keep that implicit boundary in place, there was a whole series of deconfliction channels and mechanisms that were established. In the air channels, in the air operations business, as well as on the ground between our CGATF OIR commander and his Russian counterpart. But that was reinforced by diplomatic activities between heads of state, between foreign ministers, between chiefs of defense, as well as numerous other contacts to ensure that things didn't bump into one another on either side of the Euphrates River. So ultimately, this whole of coalition effort also became ensuring that members of the 79 activity or coalition well understood what was going on. The U.S. and the coalition did not have to make a series of command structure changes to prosecute the campaign because the requisite authorities were generally in the hands of the military leadership, and the delineation of battle space certainly helped preventing that bumping into one another of the forces. But also, these challenges had been discussed at multiple echelons by multiple leaders to deal with the what-if contingencies. I think that will be necessary in any future type of proxy warfare. Bottom line, the command and control architecture was reasonably flat, adaptive, and capable of working across the diplomatic, Ministry of Defense, and Chief of Defense channels and across all domains. Here's my second point. This sort of campaigning is a whole of government effort. There tends to be an overemphasis on military activities, and most of you are wearing a uniform there. I'd argue there's nothing wrong with that. But I've learned in over a decade of campaigning is that the approach between the military and non-military means has to be complementary. And that complementary is what I began to describe as a blended approach. By this, I mean every member of the team leverages their advantages. And certain organizations, like the military, brings a lot more heft and a lot more mass than many of our assistants and foreign affairs colleagues. You have to build upon that and not worry about who gets the credit. And if it doesn't work together in interesting ways, you never are able to deal with the humanitarian assistance needs, the reduction of remnants of war, the efforts to build stabilization and the reestablishment of essential services, because everybody is too busy pointing the finger at the other guy as the person who should be taking the lead. What I've learned in this fight against Daesh is that there are many future challenges that I think we will see not only in this campaign, but in the campaign to deal with other violent extremists and proxies. Clandestine threats require more than the military. They require law enforcement and intelligence. These bad guys are innovative. They think and they change and they adapt. And you will see that play out in the campaign up in Idlib province or in the clandestine aspects, not only in Iraq, but also northeastern Syria. Radical information sharing is free. Take advantage of it and learn how to share better. Coming to grips with Daesh's use of ideology and violent extremism and the social media challenge is something that is solely lacking. Foreign terrorist fighters will come home, figure out how you want to deal with it, and decide what needs to be done to reinforce border security and the flow and movement of these people. Dealing with the bad guy's money is a whole of government activity. It requires sometimes kinetic opportunity, but it also requires a lot of people out of ministries of finance and departments of treasury. And then finally, bad guys adapt, and they usually telegraph what they're going to do. Here's my third point. You've studied what your adversaries will probably do, and you'll talk a lot about that in the next 2 days. Every complex environment is going to have proxies. The Syrian Democratic Forces in northeastern Syria was comprised of Syrian Kurds and Sunni Arab tribesmen who worked to defeat Daesh. But at the same time, you've seen Iranian proxies, you've seen other proxy forces operate as part of Assad's tactical guarantor. You can expect more of that. Again, going back to my Russian Chad friend, he would describe the series of activities that can be employed from a kinetic side of the house as precision strike, ISR, barrel bombs as terror weapons, drones, UAVs for tactical precision, jamming, all in support of maneuver forces, whether it's Assad's Tiger Force or it's the Russian Fifth Corps. You will see much more of this. So go back and rewind the tape and look at what happened on the west side of the Euphrates River Valley, as well as what happened in western Syria in the de-escalation zones. I would argue it's a good case study to better understand the adversary. In conclusion, imagining the sort of conventional fight as well as proxy, hybrid, or regular warfare fight your militaries will have to deal with is the key to better understanding what your manning, training, equipping requirements are and having the right capability and capacity on the battlefield. This is competitive space, as the CDS talked about already. Recognizing these environments will require both a blending of military and non-military capabilities seems obvious and has to be trained before employment. In my opinion, we aren't sufficiently trained to do whole of government, and that requires working with our diplomats and our assistance people and friends to do more. And then lastly, in conclusion, this proxy hybrid environment brings a range of players that places demands on all leaders. So how do you walk into that impending Star Wars bar scene and get everyone to work together for a common outcome to accomplish national and/or coalition objectives in order to terminate the fight on grounds deemed acceptable to civilian leaders? I think that's what you're struggling to think your way through. Thank you.
Dr. Bergman, you have 10 minutes.
First, apologies for being late. The blocks, because of the visit of the president, are already in place. So, apologize and thank you, RUSI, for this kind invitation. I was told I have 10 minutes and that the chair will interrupt me in 11, so I'm taking 11. Thank you for that. In 2010, I was approached by Penguin Random House Publishing House, and they asked me if I'm willing to write the history of the Mossad and special operations of Israel. I said, yes, I'll be happy to do so. They asked, how long will it take you? I said, 1 year. They said, okay, why wouldn't we write in the contract 1.5 years, just to be on the safe zone? I said, you can write whatever you like. It's going to take me 1 year. They wrote 1.5 years, and after that, I was 6 years delayed. Not exactly meeting the deadline. The main reason why it took me so long was I decided to disregard everything that was written on Israeli intelligence so far and start from scratch, interviewing everybody, collecting intelligence, collecting documents, because everything that was written so far, almost everything, seemed to me unreferenced, attributed to anonymous sources, and much of it just didn't make sense. And why is that important? Why is it important to document and write the history of special operation and intelligence, especially in our region, the Middle East and Israel? Because I believe that the operations of Israeli intelligence do not operate in vacuum. This is not a different planet. Everything, all major events in Israel, all major decision-making processes, all history turns were done with the profound impact and influence of Israeli intelligence. It is so connected, and as much as you cannot understand the history of the Second World War without understanding how profound was the impact of what happened in Station H in Bletchley Park when they decrypted the Enigma machine, something that shortened the Second World War in like 2 to 3 years. You cannot understand the history of Israel, the history of the Middle East, and sometimes when it's relevant, the history of the entire world without having a correct reading into the history of Israeli intelligence. Not everything they did is glamorous, not everything is a success. Sometimes the Jewish James Bond is more like Inspector Clouseau, but it's always important. And after 6 years delayed, we came to find the name for the book. And some person, we first wanted to name it License to Kill, but it turns out that Amazon registered alone less than 64 different books called License to Kill. So we decided we're not going to be the 65th, and someone who actually read the transcript of the 1,000 interviewees that I met in order to write the book said, you know, many of your interviewees are using the same quote from the Babylonian Talmud, which said, whoever comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. In Hebrew, Akam leorgecha, ashkem leorgo. Whoever comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. And that's the origin for the name of the book, Rise and Kill First. These interviews did not share this quote because in order to impress me with the understanding of Jewish scripture. They wanted to explain their mindset. And their mindset may be best expressed by the former chair of Mossad, now unfortunately deceased, Meir Dagan, who told me that everything, or almost everything that we did in Israeli intelligence was in the attempt to prevent war. The Six-Day War triumphant victory would not repeat itself. Israel should go for an all-out war only when the sword is on our neck. All the rest should be dealt by special operations, pinpoint operation way beyond enemy lines, sabotage, computer viruses, targeted killings. And I have decided to focus my research on these operations in the gray zone with the prime interest in targeted killings, in assassinations. Israel has used that weapon more than any country in the West after the Second World War. Even tyrants like Saddam Hussein or Stalin, who didn't have any problem with killing millions of their own, were very hesitant when it came to extrajudicial, extraterritorial targeted killing. Israel used that more than any other country. And why is that? David Ben-Gurion, who was, I think, the greatest and most important Jew in the last 1,000 years, maybe at all, he's in the League of Moses. He understood as early as June 1948, just a month after Israel was established, the end of the British Mandate, just 2 weeks after the Israeli defense forces were established, that Israel will indeed prevail in the War of Independence. He was one of the few who believed that the Jews could prevail. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, thought that the Arabs will slaughter the Jews in 2 weeks. Ben-Gurion said, no, we will win. But he understood that in order to survive, Israel will need to have a very strong and efficient intelligence community. So not to need to have the army stationed on the border, the army that is based mainly on reserve duty forces, stationed on the border throughout the year, and instead having very good intelligence service that would supply sufficient alert from any kind of intent to launch preemptive strike on Israel, giving it sufficient time to mobilize the reserve to the border. But Israeli intelligence does something more than just collecting intelligence. It translates the intelligence into the ability to perform action way beyond enemy lines. These actions are aimed to broaden the gap between the war, if not prevent the next war, and trying to prevent the next day threat, trying to prevent suicide bombing, trying to prevent Iran from producing a nuclear bomb. Israel assassinated and killed 3 kinds of targets: leaders, proliferators of weapons of mass destruction, and terrorists. Leaders are by far the group of the smallest number, because Israeli leaders were very hesitant to approve operations to kill other leaders of Arab countries or Arab organizations, because they thought that it would legitimize the killing of Israeli leaders. They were less hesitant when it came to the other 2 kinds, proliferator and terrorists. Targeted killing operations bring 2 main questions to mind. Are they legally and morally justified? And are they effective? Does the world become a better place the next day you neutralize a person? On the first question, I think that in international law, including international human rights organizations today, after the massive change in the law of conduct throughout the previous decade, agree that it is legal to kill a terrorist, sometimes referred as non-legal or illegal combatant, even when he goes to sleep in bed at night, not just when he's wearing a uniform. A, because he doesn't have a uniform. B, because he doesn't stop to be a terrorist when he goes to sleep. When it comes to morality, I think everyone has a right to judge if this is moral or not. I would just say that when you have a terrorist who recruits people to go and perform suicide killing, suicide bombing, who already sent suicide terrorists that killed many of your people, when you do not have a likely option to arrest him, then sometimes you come to conclusion that there is no other choice but take this person out, because otherwise he will continue to send more and more suicide bombers and kill more people. When it comes to effectiveness, but again, this is a matter of judgment, and everyone has her or his own opinion. When it comes to effectiveness, after 8 years of research, I can tell you that my conclusion is that when targeted killing is done systematically, when it's done as part of an overall strategy, when it's done not as a one-time, when it's done against the person that should be killed, not against those who are the intelligence service can kill, and when it's done in order to achieve a target, not just to satisfy your population at home, trying to prove that you do something, then my conclusion after 8 years of research is that yes, it can be effective. Two short examples. Between 2001 and 2004, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad sent a horrific wave of suicide bombers into Israel. And the only thing that stopped them from coming was when Israel started to kill not the suicide bombers. Hamas boasted that they have more volunteers than suicide belts, but killing the layer above them, so the bomb makers, the coordinators, the recruiters, the regional commanders, the political leaders. Only when Israel killed them, you launching the most extensive campaign of targeted killing ever launched in history. When Israel killed them, it brought Hamas on their knees begging for ceasefire. Second example is when Israel started to kill Iranian nuclear scientists. I once asked Michael Hayden, the chief of the NSA and the CIA, what was the most effective weapon that Israel or the United States used in order to hold or to delay the Iranian nuclear project, and he didn't hesitate. He said, the only thing, or the one thing that made them delay the project more than anything else, was the fact that someone, then he paused and said, Ronen, it was not us. Someone was killing their scientist. And I smiled. And he said, Ronen, don't smile. The Israelis never told us it's them. But of course, you figure out when you are in discussion at Langley, CIA headquarters, about Iranian top nuclear scientists, and some of them drop dead the next week, you figure out, and the other part of that conversation killed them. But I asked him, why was that so effective? And he recalled the meeting, the first meeting of the National Security Council that he had with the new president, Barack Obama, in early 2009, when the president asked him, Chief of the CIA, General Hayden, could you please tell me how much enriched uranium is there in Natanz? Natanz is one of the facilities that the Iranian built in order to enrich uranium. To which Michael Hayden says, Mr. President, I actually know the answer to your question, but let me tell you, it's not important. There is no one single electron from Natanz that would end up in a nuclear bomb. What they are building in Natanz is not a bomb. They are building knowledge. And Mr. President, there is only one known way in which you can destroy knowledge. Thank you very much.